and this evening for yet others. I'm Brinton Likes, a professor here at Boston College and the co-director of our Center for Human Rights and International Justice. My own work focuses on the rethreading of life in the wake of racialized and gendered violence during and after armed conflict, and on migration and detention and deportation. I'm delighted to be with you today and to welcome you to our discussion of the historic decision made by the Supreme Court of the United States last Thursday, when they ruled that the Trump administration did not provide an adequate justification for ending the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, allowing it to remain in place at least for the time being. It was a major win for the more than 650,000 DACA recipients who have been leading the resistance against the US's draconian immigration, detention, and deportation policies and practices. It was a sigh of relief for hundreds of thousands and for many of us who have accompanied them over these years. But as we all know, it is challenging in what it calls us to action to in response to the criteria that were used for the decision. I'll begin today by briefly introducing my colleagues, all affiliated with the Center for Human Rights and International Justice here at Boston College, and professors in various units on the campus. Each will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we will do our best to respond to as many of your questions as we can. To facilitate that process, we ask for you to put your questions in the chat box, and if your question is directed to one of our speakers, please so indicate. We'll select them and do the best that we can to respond. Dan Kanstroom will go first. He's a professor of law and the Thomas Carney Distinguished Scholar at the Boston College School of Law. He's also the faculty director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy, and with me co-directs our Center for Human Rights and International Justice. He's published widely in the fields of US immigration law, human rights, criminal law, and European citizenship and asylum law. He will briefly present the legal history of DACA and the recent SCOTUS decision, including what it means to have it remanded to the lower court and for the Supreme Court to have noted that it made no decision on the legality or not of DACA. He will also tell us what he sees as some of the challenges facing all who support DACA methods as this administration continues to seek to get rid of DACA, quote unquote, the right way. Gabriela Oliveira is an assistant professor of education at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development. Her research focuses on the educational and care experiences of immigrant families from Latin America in the United States. She's author of the recent book, Motherhood Across Borders, Immigrants and Their Children in Mexico and New York, and is currently a fellow with the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation, doing research with families who were detained or separated at the border, but have now been reunited in Massachusetts. Gabi was born and raised in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and did her master's and doctoral work at Teachers College in Colombia. She's also the co-founder of the group Colectiva Infancias, which develops free courses on sociology and anthropology of children and migration in Latin America. She will pivot our discussion to some of the personal impacts of this decision, sharing some of her research with parents and families that are mixed status and how they understand what the decision means for them. Those with whom she is working include parents who are DACA and children who are US born, and adults who are DACA but with parents who are undocumented. Raquel Muñiz is currently an assistant professor of law and education policy, also at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, and serves as a liaison with the law school and a coordinator of BC's joint degrees in law and education. Her research examines the impact of law and policy in the education system, the uses of social science evidence in the legal system and public policy decision-making, and how we can create more equity for those who have experienced substantial adversity throughout their lives. Through her research, she has worked on civil rights issues affecting brown and Black student populations across the K through 20 years, including as a lead researcher on the Center for Immigrant Rights Clinic's research study on the experiences of documented lawyers and law students under the Trump administration. She also provides pro bono support for asylum seekers through different organizations providing legal support. Raquel will discuss these issues in the higher education context, what support institutions currently provide our documented students and those without DACA who also lack appropriate documents to stay in the United States, and what else we can do in our institutions. Again, a reminder, if you have questions and they go to a particular speaker, please include them in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Brenton, I'm going to try to put on this screen share because I have a PowerPoint, so bear with me for one moment. Should be showing now.
You got it.
Got it? Okay. Well, I mean, there's so much to talk about regarding DACA. It's hard to think of a human rights issue that's more complicated, more poignant, more portentous. But I would suggest that to understand it, it's helpful to pay attention to three related aspects of what's going on. I think the first has to be the incredibly poignant and powerful human considerations regarding a particular subset of people and all of their friends and their loved ones and their families who lacked status in the United States and who faced deportation of a type, for them particularly, that was uniquely cruel and disproportionate. I think the second aspect is historical. We can't really understand DACA without understanding the extremely harsh backdrop against which it was enacted. This was a quarter century of extremely harsh, brutal, inhumane, massive exclusion and deportation enforcement by the US government, from Reagan to Bush to Clinton to Bush, and yes, to Obama, and most strenuously and inhumanely to Trump. And this leads to the third point, as Brenton indicated, the strangely technical aspects of what DACA was and where it fits in our legal system. And I think all of these are relevant. So let me see if I can get to my second slide. To be specific, I think we can start with understanding that this was an executive order. It was a unilateral exercise of presidential power. Most of us who liked it when Obama did it definitely hate it when Trump does it. And people can deploy arguments about separation of powers and executive authority and so forth fairly flexibly. So it's a legal complexity that we have to understand. Was DACA ever legally legitimate? My own feeling about it is yes, it was, but it's complicated and we don't have time to get into it. And I don't think people want to get into all of the details of that. But yes, I think it was legitimate, but it was a complicated legitimacy tree. Anti-immigrant advocates and many conservatives who are not actually anti-immigrant but have a particular view of government said no, it was not legitimate from the start. So I want to come back to this point in a minute because it was very relevant to what the Supreme Court did. You see the third point. We cannot divorce anything that we say about legal doctrine or politics or policy from the human aspects of this. As Obama said in 2012, these are young people who study in our schools, they play in our neighborhoods, they're friends with our kids, they pledge allegiance to our flag. I'm not so sure about that, but many do. I don't think they have to, I guess would be my point, in order to be the recipients of this sort of a law. But he said, but they are Americans in their heart, in their minds, in every single way but one, on paper. And that was the narrative. But another part of the narrative was that this came as a result of legislative failure to enact the DREAM Act, to reform the immigration system. This was never anybody's first option. There was immense pressure put on Obama and others through demonstrations, through organizing, through telling stories about what was happening to people. And finally, actually, it was only in 2012, and he was elected president 4 years before that, he came around and did this one particular thing. So it was responsive in some ways, it was late in other ways, it was tenuously legitimate in yet other ways. Now, to appreciate again what happened at the Supreme Court, we also have to understand that 2 years after that, this was expanded. So they created something called DAPA, which was a program designed to help the parents of the DACA recipients. And they expanded DACA in certain technical ways that we don't really have to get into all the details of. But it was sort of a continuing dance between the hope for a legislative solution which would have resolved the legitimacy questions, but actually many of the legislative solutions were not as protective as DACA, certainly not for people who were not sort of the best and the brightest. DACA had very strict requirements, which I think others may go into in terms of education and lack of criminal record and so forth. So it sort of divided the community of people without papers, let's say, or undocumented, into sort of the really good ones who had very strong claims, and it tended to relegate others And I think that has some negative consequences as well. In any case, legal challenges for various reasons were not actually brought against initial DACA in 2012. And it's complicated to say why, because many of us thought they're going to challenge this right out of the gate, but they didn't. What they did do was they challenged DAPA, and they challenged expanded DACA. And the basic arguments were that the president did not have the power to do this. One of the lines of argument, there were a number of them, but one was that it violated the so-called take care clause of the Constitution. The idea being the president has a duty to take care that the laws are enforced, and Obama was not enforcing the laws through this, they would say, excessive delegation of prosecutorial discretion to an entire group of people. So that went to the Fifth Circuit. It was adjudicated in the first instance by a judge named Hanen, who was a Bush appointee. And ultimately, he ruled against the Obama administration. The Fifth Circuit upheld him. Then it came to the Supreme Court. But in between, Justice Scalia died, and the court split 4-4. And this left an injunction in place. That's an order by the court for the government not to be able to implement DAPA and expanded DACA. But the original DACA stood for the time being. So that's why DACA has continued through these challenges. Well, then we come to the Trump administration. And here, I think it's, again, important to understand that the Trump attempt to kill DACA, original DACA, was, to put it briefly, nasty, brutish, and short. It was swift, summary, and brutal. Basically, Trump told Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, you may remember him, that this is illegal. Now, he didn't have to tell him that because Sessions felt that way and had written about this before that it was illegal for the reasons that I mentioned before. And he said, get rid of it. And then Sessions said to Elaine Duke, who was the head of DHS at the time, get rid of it. And she wrote a very, very summary memorandum that had really no reasoning in it, paid no attention to the immense harm this was going to cause to all people, didn't deal with the reliance interest. A lot of things were not there. This is essentially what she said, taking into consideration what happened at the Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit, but that was about DAPA and expanded DACA. It's clear that the 2012 program should be terminated. So that's what she did. And that was in 2017. Challenges were brought, and ultimately there are two of them that are still alive, actually maybe more than two, but two big ones, one brought by the NAACP and the other by the University of California. And the one that we're talking about is the California case that came to the Supreme Court, and the court held some very important things. First of all, and this might seem like a technical detail, but it's incredibly important, DACA is reviewable by courts. That is to say, the court said, this is not just some exercise of discretion that's unreviewable. And I mention this because one of the pernicious things that happened in 1996 were limitations that were put on the ability of courts to even adjudicate things. The case came down yesterday about expedited removal. I think it's a horrible case that says that a person can be summarily deported and no judge will ever hear that person's claim about asylum. That was a Sri Lankan case. But here, the court said, well, DACA is reviewable. But they didn't get to the heart of the matter. They said, as Brenton indicated at the outset, we addressed only whether the agency complied with the procedural requirements and provide a reasoned explanation for its action. And patently, they didn't. There was no reasoned explanation. So they failed to consider whether to retain forbearance, which was the idea of not deporting people, and didn't consider, this was very important in my mind, what, if anything, to do about the hardship to DACA recipients. That was a signal that it's not just procedural. Actually, the majority was saying, we do recognize that there's a hardship issue here. Anyway, they held that what happened was arbitrary and capricious, and under general rule of law principles, that made it illegal. The case was then remanded. DACA is now back in effect, or continues to be in effect, but there is no doubt that Trump will try again, and various other legal challenges continue. The original controversy about this is very much alive. You saw it in the dissent in the recent case. The dissenters said, this has to be recognized as an effort to avoid a politically controversial but legally correct decision. The court could have made clear that the solution respondents seek must come from the legislative branch. The court didn't do that, obviously, but I think we're going to have to come back to that. More worrisome to me, or equally worrisome, is this. Trump has very strongly said, we're going to resubmit. This was a shotgun blast into the face of people that are proud to call themselves Republicans or conservatives. I mean, the mind boggles at how he could say such a thing about this, but there it is. And they are going to resubmit shortly. But in the meantime, as I said, the status quo prevails. What does the agency think? This is unbelievable. The agency, soon after the decision, says, today's court opinion has no basis in law. But it's a Supreme Court opinion. That is the basis in law. That's what law is. So for the immigration agency, in writing to say the Supreme Court's opinion has no basis in law, tells us a lot about how far we are sinking in this country if we don't grab onto something fast. Because this is now a lawless agency, and who knows what they're going to do. I'm very worried about that. So what's next? The Texas litigation is now back on. Judge Hainan has given people 30 days to resubmit. And if DACA is not simply a non-enforcement policy, as Justice Roberts said at the Supreme Court, this could actually strengthen the substantive challenge to DACA. But that's not going to happen. That's going to take a while. The other case is the NAACP case in DC. That's probably likely to be more favorable owing to the judge. But in any case, I don't think anything will happen before the elections. So what does this mean? New applications could be allowed. Extensions could be allowed, work authorization should be allowed, but everything is up for grabs because who knows what this agency is capable of doing. So as a lawyer, I'd be very wary about applying for things. Advanced parole is another thing that maybe people could get, and various other immigration remedies. But again, we're seeing an agency practice of recalcitrance and denial and a very mean-spirited attitude. As I said, litigation will definitely continue, and maybe this guy will bring us a new DREAM Act. Who knows? I certainly don't. Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear what others have to say about this.
Thank you, Dan, very much. Gabi will now turn to you, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brinton, for the introduction. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Tim, who's there for organizing this. Hi, everybody. This is so helpful to hear that. Thank you for that great mini lesson, Dan. It puts a lot of things in perspective, and I guess a lot, for lots of us who are researchers or that work in the field and don't know the nitty-gritty of law and what does that mean. In my case, I text Raquel a lot and I just ask her to explain to me when I have any questions. So I appreciate being able to have this conversation. So what I wanted to briefly talk to you all about in the next 9 minutes here, is the fact that, so I've been doing research with immigrant families and children for the last 10 years. And back in, when I started in the field in 2010, and then what I thought it would be interesting to talk to you about today is how families that I worked with back in 2012, when this was all starting to happening, what are their lives looking like right now? And this week I was able to go back and interview a lot of them from my 2012, field work and kind of see where they are and what does this decision mean for them, right? Like, what is this? Because we can have interpretations about what does it mean for the law, the precedents and everything, but what does it mean for families who are already situated in an incredibly vulnerable space? So this particular family that I'll give you the example for today is, so Sophia was 17 years old when I met her in 2011. And she was pregnant with her first baby then. She had just left school and she was looking for a GED program that had childcare so she could continue her studies. So I was at their house with her mom, right? Her mom had come to the US 8 years prior. So she brought Sophia with her when Sophia was 9. And Sophia had been going to school in Sunset Park, New York for the last several years. She was an incredible student. The teachers were really sad when she left school because the schedule wasn't working for her as she was approaching her due date to have her first baby. And so after the end of June, when I was talking to her in 2012, she said, what are your thoughts about me registering? Those are the words she used, for DACA. Should I do it? Is it safe, right, for me to do it? And I remember thinking, I don't know. First of all, I don't have enough knowledge to advise anybody, but I was puzzled about where was she coming from. And she was explaining to me that one of her main fears was that it would be taken away from her. And I keep going back to her rationale, which was visionary in many ways, because then look at what came after, right? This back and forth about kind of her life being played with in terms of who has ownership about what her future was going to look like. So at the time, you know, that's a quote from her. She said, "I feel like I just played with my luck. I just put my life on the record for a lottery," right? So she's kind of saying that she's putting her name out there, and then in her words and the words of her mom, they were saying, could the government ever come after us because they now have our information, right? And I remember back then I was still on my student visa, and I was thinking probably, because I thought, you know, I always felt so surveilled anyway, so I figured, you know, that's a good point in terms of thinking about it. But at the same time, it sounded like a really good opportunity, right, for what was happening. So she went ahead, she applied, she received DACA. She was able to go, you know, to a 4-year college in New York City. She was able to get funds to go to college. She ended up, you know, talking to her again. She has 2 more babies, so she's a mom of 3. So when I was talking to her this week, I was asking her about, you know, what does this mean to you now that you look back at your trajectory, right? And she said to me, you know, that's a quote from her. She said, "I was so nervous. I've been so nervous since they started to stop DACA. I started this process as a student getting my GED, and now I'm a mother of 3. My 3 babies, they need their mom. I don't want to be away from my babies. It feels like they want to take our families from us. It feels cruel. So in the middle of my mother being sick with the virus, my life was again put into the lottery. And with God and people, I feel like I'm at peace for the moment when I look at my babies," right? So she's kind of saying that, you know, in many ways, this is a piece of the puzzle, right, for her, because her family's already in a vulnerable population. So she's a mother now before she was a student with DACA, she's a mother now of 3 babies who were born here. So they're US citizens. Her mother continues to be undocumented, was sick with coronavirus, and they struggled with that, right? And then now the other piece of what's also happening in this administration is that the work visas, right, of potential teachers that could be coming to this country to teach in Spanish and Portuguese or other languages that immigrant kids, you know, need in instruction are also now going to be able to come. So what I think is really interesting to think about for Sophia's case is that she's really, you know, she was really thinking about how vulnerable it felt to her, that policy. And she didn't even know that it was an executive order, that it could have been pulled out at any moment, that it would go to the Supreme Court, but it already felt like that. That was already her interpretation, right, of how it felt fragile. And the other thing that is really interesting in my conversations with her is that she always talks about how she feels that the DACA face of the person in the US is this incredibly successful, you know, student at a high level university. And she was saying, that's not my story. And in many ways, her story, she feels like it's not always represented by the media. And then it also becomes this narrative of, look, there's this 600, 700,000 people who are in these colleges and they're, you know, the best in their class and they're this, and it's great if they are, and they are, right? But there are many people who are experiencing different lives who shouldn't be left behind in the narrative. Because if for Sophia, this was the number 1 piece of legislation in her lived experience that changed the course of her life, right? In terms of being able to finish her school and go to college and have a stable job. So for her, she's really counting on it. But in the way that I always go back to her 2012 quote, and all her fears that for me at the moment felt like, okay, I'm trying to understand, but I wasn't completely sure. And in many ways, it's almost like she saw the whole thing unravel before it even started. So at this moment, her words are that she feels good about what happened. As I read you the quote, she said, because God and the people, right? So she was referencing to people doing protests and doing this public pressure. So she's incredibly thankful for that. She herself doesn't feel like she could be in the streets protesting. She feels vulnerable. And so in many ways, who can shoulder the responsibility to make sure that she can have a stable life right? It's another conversation that I have with her a lot. So what I wanted to kind of bring our attention to is, as researchers and as students, as people who do advocacy and who do accompaniment, right, in the way that Brenton here also does, what are some of the things that are so important for us to listen when these young folks and adults, right, are telling us about how they feel about these big policies that are about to be implemented. And in many ways, even without the legal knowledge, they know how that can, you know, transform their lives, but also keep their lives in this limbo of things that can be given to them and taken from them in the same rate, right, in terms of speed. So I'll stop here and I'll welcome questions, but really great to be here with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabby, and thank you, Dan and Gabby. We have both, from very different points of view, a focus on narratives and whose stories can we hear and whose stories are we listening to, and what are the stories that come out of our judicial system, but what are the stories that come off of our streets and our schools. And we'll now turn to Raquel to hear a bit more about a different set of stories and what our institutions, how our institutions are responding. You're on mute, Raquel. There you go.
Can you hear me now? And can you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you again, Brenton, Dan, Gabby, Tim, for putting this together. So what I want to talk about today is really about the higher ed component and dimension in relation to the DACA policy in general, undocumented students, right? And also what the Supreme Court decision means for this context. So in order to contextualize that conversation, I think it's important to begin with a discussion around some of the challenges that are unique to undocumented students given their status. And they can be categorized into three. They are predominantly Latinx, right? And this is not at all by any means comprehensive of all their experiences, but they seem to fall into three big buckets, categories, so to speak, regarding their challenges. So first, a lot of them are first generation students. And so they faced issues regarding access to the application process for college, knowing where to find the funding, and understanding and navigating the higher education system in general. Often they have financial aid that is limited, right, to be able to access and complete their education. And so this typically forces them to find multiple jobs in order to be able to, one, finance that higher education, but also support their family members. And an added dimension to that is that a lot of them would identify as non-traditional students. So they commute to campus instead of living on campus, the vast majority. And this has an added dimension of risk where they live in states where they're not able to have a driver's license, right? So they're driving without the license and risking potential deportation depending on whether they're stopped and the consequences that might follow. They're also in mixed status families. So what this means is that, as our very own Dan Kanstroom has pointed out before, the US has become sort of a deportation nation, right? And so there's a fear not only for regarding their own deportation, but also the fear that their family members might be deported, those who have not yet fixed their status. And so it varies across. So they live with this uncertainty, with this fear, and that often leads to a lot of mental health concerns, right? They, as they come of age, a lot of them find out about their undocumented status during the high school years, and that affects their sense of belonging. They encounter more negative climates, both in the institutional education institutions, but also locally and at the statewide. And right now with the Trump administration, I mean, the national anti-immigrant sentiment is quite prevalent as well. And so this often leads to different feelings such as having guilt, shame, lower self-esteem, anxiety, and feeling sort of as though they live in the margins, right? And so mental health support services are so critical as they're going through their education, both in high school, well, earlier on, but especially as they're transitioning over to post-secondary education, and then once they arrive in the actual higher ed institutions. But the research has also shown that they're incredibly resilient and they have this determination to achieve academically. They're highly engaged both with community organizations and civically through advocacy groups. There's an increase as they move on the academic trajectory. Typically, they become more and more involved. And regardless, well, I should say, in spite of all the challenges that they face, they're typically very hopeful about their future in the United States and are really cling on to the idea that there will be a solution. And of course, the civic engagement is prevalent, as I mentioned. So that's sort of from the individual perspective, but the campuses also face a large array of challenges, including one that is not only for undocumented students, but for all students in general, the college affordability, right? And for undocumented students, particularly if they don't have access or have limited access to financial aid, this becomes an added pressure. They also cannot access any sort of federal grants or loans, which only complicates the situation. And then the state dimension, there are policies that, I should say the policies are quite fragmented and vary from state to state. And so this has been described as creating pockets of inclusion and pockets of exclusion, all depending on where people live. So to give you an example here, currently there are 9 states that have restrictive policies, and even within those 9 states, there's variability. So just to give you 2 clear examples, Alabama, right, currently prohibits enrollment of undocumented students. Later on, moved on to allow DACA recipients to enroll, but only in select universities, and then remains silent around policies on aid. And South Carolina, on the other hand, just bans enrollment for undocumented students at public higher institutions. They allow DACA recipients to enroll, but they explicitly prohibit any kind of aid. And so it just varies all across. What's also quite surprising is that 22, nearly half of all the states, don't have any kind of policy at all. They're just silent around the issues affecting undocumented students. And so this is from my own work. We examined the flagship institutions and the policies that they have regarding documented students. And what we found is that although there's a lot of outward support, right, like they're verbally issuing out statements, there are only about 7 institutions across the nation that provide interconnected support services across campuses. And so there's reason for hope, because it seems like there's an awareness of the issues affecting students, but also there's a long way to go, right, if only 7 are really providing that additional support. Some of the assets that the campuses do have that have been shown to be helpful in the experiences of documented and undocumented students are making sure that we provide spaces that make them feel safe and in community, facilitating the ability for them to build peer networks, being also educated and keeping up with all the very rapid changes that are occurring so that we can be as supportive as educators. And also student organizations. These are incredible spaces of support because students can continue to work with their peers and build those networks as well. And also they do advocacy in a lot of the campuses that do have such student organizations. So what did DACA do? Dan already sort of described there was a deferred deportation and a Social Security and work authorization. I often think about those as primary benefits, but there were a lot of secondary benefits that really helped undocumented students. Among those, chief is having a peace of mind, right? Because you have a decreased fear about your own deportation, and also feeling safer. Likewise, people were able to have better income, move up the social mobility, be able to acquire driver's licenses that before they weren't able to, so on and so forth, even accessing healthcare on campus, which is so crucial, and access tuition and in-state rates at select states. So in many ways, the DACA ruling, which basically keeps the policy in place, didn't change much for the status quo, and I should say short term, right? So it leaves things as they were. People are able to continue to apply. So what we can do in the higher ed space is continue to provide the resources that we already do, but build upon those, because again, those are limited even when they're there. And then there's a cause for worry that I think Dan talked about earlier on, right? Because in some ways, the court not only said the Trump administration unlawfully did the policy, but also talked a little bit about how and what it would look like to do it lawfully, right? So yes, it takes time, but it almost provides a bit of a roadmap. So it emphasizes the need for a permanent solution, and because we're still living in a lot of uncertainty, it could potentially increase the anxiety for our students on campus that are both undocumented and documented. So as I mentioned, specific actions around how we can support them. These are, again, not comprehensive, but they're the marginalization of undocumented students and documented students didn't occur through one single action, right? And so it requires that we think about the multiple ways that we can support them. So one of them could be building on the assets that we do have. So if there aren't particular student organizations supporting them already, people can advocate and form these groups on campus to provide the support and the advocacy. We should also remember that it's not a permanent solution, so there are advocacy efforts across the country going on regarding legislation, right, such as the DREAM Act. And at the state level as well, changing or advocating for those policies that can provide in-state rates for students that are undocumented and documented, but also aid, right? Because that has become a huge challenge, being able to pay for that education. I want to briefly just mention a couple of organizations that are local and at the state level, such as the Student Immigrant Movement. It's youth-led. People from 13 to 30 years. They provide not only that space of support, but they do actual advocacy, as well as the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, MIRA. Right, they also advocate, and right now, for example, one of the things that they're working on is trying to advocate for the passage of the Work and Family Mobility Act, which would allow undocumented immigrants here in Massachusetts to have a driver's license. And then just nationally, Mi Gente, United We Dream, and to end on the same note as Dan, the DREAM Act legislation. Call your legislators and so that we can get something more permanent to remove some of the additional challenges that they face.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Thank all three of you. I'd like to begin by asking a question, and then we have one question, I think, for you, Dan, about what Sotomayor said in the opinion and what options, if any, that offers. But before we move to that specific question, I wonder if any of you would like to address how you see this issue situated within the context in which we're living now in the United States. Raquel talked specifically about immigrant organizations, but we're obviously living in a situation in which, to use some of the language in Raquel's presentation about how DACA students feel about high anxiety and stress with the pandemic, and also with the extraordinary organizing and resistance on the streets to demand an end to police violence against African Americans and Latinx and indigenous communities. How do you see the possibility of sustaining organizing and resistance around immigration issues in the midst of what else is going on here, particularly in light of some of the priorities that Dan articulated of the Trump administration, which seem to move precisely in the opposite direction? Anybody?
can start. So I would say, one of the things that for me is always interesting to think about was from Sophia's conversation, this idea that she doesn't feel like she can be the one, in the streets. And we talked about, what's happening right now with police brutality and this current discussion. And it's interesting because in many ways her narrative is so layered in terms of trying to understand how to prioritize survival, essentially, right? So I think that I would say that I think that for the folks who are in these circumstances, that sometimes they become the expected ones to be protesting, demonstrating, asking for it, and it shouldn't be. And I think that's one of the reasons we are in the mess that we are, is that because we keep, assuming that because of people's identity, they should do that work for them and then not other folks who are involved. So I think that I'm reluctant to, I feel like it's hard specifically with the immigrant youth that I particularly work with. They are reluctant to be visible because of the circumstance that we have in this administration and the ways that this administration is signaling that it will not stop, that it will be restless until it gets what it wants, right? So I think they're getting that. And there's more, my feeling is that there's more fear and going back in from a lot of folks than the visibility one. So that's kind of the other facet of it.
Dan.
Well, first of all, I want to commend Gabby and Raquel. Those are fantastic presentations. And I've learned a lot from this. And I think that having a presentation as we're doing now, which is legal, but also interdisciplinary in the deepest way, is really what the center was set up to do. And I'm just really glad that we're still doing it. So thank you for including me in it. Sonny Robinson asked a question, Brenton, and I think in answering I can answer both at the same time because they're related. What Justice Sotomayor said in this opinion was there was also a challenge to what Trump did that was based on equal protection. That is to say that it was clearly racist what Trump did by going after the people that he's been going after. The same argument, of course, was raised in the Trump versus Hawaii case, the travel ban case. Unfortunately, in that case, the court said, we're not going to look at statements that he made, or we're not really going to get into that. And she was raising it again and saying, we need to look at that because it's so clear what the motivation is for this, and that it violates equal protection of the laws. He's clearly going after people of color. So that's what Sotomayor said, but she was the only one who said it in the court. And I think in light of what happened yesterday in the expedited removal case, which raised similar questions, I'm not optimistic about getting a court majority for that position, but I think that is ultimately what's going on. That is the strongest argument that we can make about the real world. And that leads to one other thing that I just want to say. I'm personally incredibly heartened by the rise of hashtag Black Lives Matter and by seeing all these young people in the streets. That's not our subject for today, but I think it's related. I think that gives me some cause for optimism because I think rights arise out of political struggle and organizing in that way. And it's good to see that energy and enthusiasm. It's more than good. I mean, it's obviously tragic as well. But I worry that immigration status is still kind of viewed by many people as a kind of legitimate form of discrimination. That is to say that people violated the law, so they take what they get. And this is very hard to break into, and I've spent much of my career trying to break that down. But I worry about that for the reasons that Gabi was saying. People are afraid to step up. They have trouble asserting their claims anymore. And the courts have just not really recognized human rights as belonging to humans, not by virtue of status, but by virtue of human dignity or just being human. And that really is where I think we need to go in our conversations and in our organizing.
So that's related to a question here about what the government's justification, that is, would they have sufficient strength to be able to overthrow DACA? And it's also related to, my question is really not about Latinxes or DACAs. It's about what we as part of the dominant culture, what's our responsibility to make those connections that Dan was just articulating. Because I do think that immigration status is not recognized, nor are international issues more broadly. So I don't know, Dan or Raquel, whether you have anything to respond to this question about the justification that would allow the government to overthrow DACA.
Well, I want to hear from Raquel, but I'll just say quickly that if the substantive issue came to this court about whether the president had the authority to enact DACA in the first place, I am not optimistic that John Roberts would say Obama had the authority in the first place to do it. But as I think Raquel said, the court has laid out a roadmap as to what it's different to pull something away from people after you've given it to them 8 years after the fact. That raises other issues of law and due process and various other things. And I don't know how the agency would say we're going to account for that. I mean, what could you do? Say we'll give you a year to wrap up your affairs, break up your families, and then self-deport? I mean, that seems not like much to me. But who knows with this court? It's very hard to predict where John Roberts stands on this, and he's now the pivotal vote on all of these things.
Raquel, do you want to?
The one thing, I agree with all the statements. The one thing that I would add is that these issues of immigration are very intertwined with issues of racism and the way that we have set up our systems here in the US, including the legal system. So I was very heartened to see that Sotomayor was the only one. Well, I wasn't heartened that she was the only one, but I was heartened to see that she brought up the issue of racism, right, and called it out as she saw it. But nobody else did. And it's all behind the veil of neutrality and objectivity in the legal system. And so that, I think, gives us pause, and it makes me think about what we can do right in the legal field as we're bringing these issues before the courts, and maybe thinking about not making them so isolated and kind of working under the assumption that the legal system is some autonomous system, but rather that these are affecting human lives and there's a social component to it that should not be easily dismissed in the process. I think as a dominant culture, that's something that can be taken up. I know it sounds like a huge task, right? But it could be taken up and potentially change the way that we think about human rights and civil rights for those that are in the minority.
Thank you. There's a specific question for you, Raquel, and then a broader question about whether any of you know who's advising on the issues, given how Dan ended his presentation. But the question for you, Raquel, is about the AACU and its position on DACA and whether or not you think they should issue direction to member institutions who are hiring new presidents about whether they will support DACA students in any way. That is, should they be more aggressive in pushing their position?
So I think that statements are great. I do think that they need to be made. But what I think needs to be behind those statements is action, right? And reallocation of resources and power. And it's not done through one specific policy or law, but I think that it works in conjunction, both structures, support, resources, allocating money, and also the culture, right? Examining ourselves daily and how we interact with those that are marginalized. I mean, I myself included, right? I'm in the marginalized population. So it needs to be sort of in tandem. So to straight to the question, yes, I think that they should provide more guidance, but we really do need leadership that is willing to call things out as they see them and to provide resources where they're most needed, supporting those marginalized populations along the way.
Thank
I
you.
can try to get to David's question about Biden. I wouldn't name names, but I think that where Biden comes from and where his advisors come from is not actually a strong immigrant rights position particularly. I think he comes from a sort of what I would call a kind of older school racial justice, position, not dissimilar from where Obama came from. And as we've seen, that's not necessarily a formula for radical change of the immigration system, to say the very least. Obama got bogged down in healthcare, and that he lost a lot of political capital and wasn't able to shepherd an immigration reform bill through. I'm not tremendously optimistic that Biden will be much different from that. But what will happen is, and I know he's aware of this, a lot of different kinds of people will head these agencies instead of people like Cuccinelli and Kirsten Nielsen and so forth. And so things can change in terms of discretionary practices, but I wouldn't anticipate a radical, I mean, radical is not even the right word, but let's say a strongly progressive surge from Joe Biden. I think that would be wildly optimistic to think that that would happen, unless he feels that he needs to support from that community. And maybe, you know, this is his time to start, you know, holding his feet to the fire and getting some real commitments. Because we thought, and I was part of those discussions with the Obama transition people, we thought that a lot more was agreed to and promised by Obama in 2007 and 2008 than ultimately translated into law. And that was part of the controversy and the anger that people felt at that administration's inability to actually get this done. I fear we may be recapitulating some of that, but of course, it'll be so much better than Trump. There's just no comparison.
There's a related question here also from Sunny about viable plans for legislative efforts to secure DACA or to reintroduce DACA in any way. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about whether it's possible, particularly if there's some capacity to take the Senate in addition to the House, to push this issue there.
Well, I mean, there's a number of proposals out there, but none of them for example, the question of TPS, that is something that would fall under the mandate of probably the administrative discretion in a new administration would be much more generous to people with TPS. But TPS is temporary by virtue of its name. For those who don't know, that's temporary protected status. But some people have been in that status for years now. So you have the same questions of reliance and discretionary approaches to deportation that take into account the hardship that comes when you force a person to leave the country after they've been here and formed connections and so forth. But when you say viable plans, viability will all depend on what happens in November.
And the Senate.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
I would add, I just would add that on the one thing that I was happy to hear on the Biden side is that there is on their education unity task force, one of the people that is there leading it is Hiro Yoshikawa, who's a professor at NYU, who is, you know, his immigration studies and the impact. And I think it really helps for especially early education, elementary education. I think I was really happy to see that there was attention in something that it's usually not, you know, where the advisors get put in to do anything. So I was happy to see that.
Yeah, that raises, I think, a really important issue, which this panel has helped shed light on, which is the ways in which this particular issue around migration can be introduced at a variety of other arenas of policymaking and advising to Biden as he pushes forward. And it then also raised the issue of the elections in the sense that the Latinx community, which is not unified in the sense of necessarily supporting one candidate, but they may not have a lot of options. So if they're going to get out to vote, that's another set of ways in which we can press for that. We are out of time, I think, and we seem to have addressed the questions on our chat. I want to join Dan's thanks to all of you, and to thank Dan in particular, and to thank Tim, who has, as Raquel mentioned, been behind the scenes making this happen for all of us. The Center for Human Rights and International Justice will continue to host opportunities to address this and other issues, and constantly looks for ways of thinking from an interdisciplinary and a transnational perspective about these issues. So thank you all who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you at other events. And be safe and try and find some small way to laugh or at least enjoy some dimension of being together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenton.